today. So this evening is a special session of the Talmud class that gets us focused on the redemption of captives within the Jewish tradition. And I want to again say thank you to Barry Kohler, Dr. Kohler. Thank you, Barry, for being in the Talmudic and Mishnaic and Ram and Maimonidean area of a student of all of that in your own time. And we found each other at an event, and we were talking about this issue that had come up about how to include the issue of the hostages, the matter of the hostages within our Seder experience, within our Passover experience. And that led me to a little deeper reading, and we shared some resources, and I'm sure Barry will have what to contribute tonight as I ask him to reflect on what he's learned and how he's going to contribute to the Seder experience, or just take this with him into Pesach this year, as we all need to, and we all feel a connection to, I hope, because this day 193 and 20 hours, we don't know who's really still sitting in darkness alive, to be really honest with each other, and we don't know where they are. We don't know if anybody was flown off to Qatar or Iran. We don't know exactly what the situation is and who may be brought out. And it may even be so cruel as to be on Pesach. I think we have to prepare ourselves mentally for any of that reality. And this idea that we have Seder experience coming, at which we focus ourselves on this matter, one could ask halachically right from the start, does that take away from our Chag experience and from the Chag Simcha that we're supposed to generate? So let's just put that on the table first. And let me address that for a second. The idea that we really steer into Ganai and not just Shevach, that we have a tradition that invites us first to really say what went wrong, what was the burden, what was the slavery like, what was the tyranny that the world experienced. We bring that out during our ritual. We do not avoid such things. You know, the Torah is about curses one week in the Parsha. The Torah is talking about the death of so-and-so. We're not supposed to share bad news on Shabbos. We read it. Debates happened over halachic history as to whether or not we should excise certain segments of Torah. We read some in a whisper to kind of nod to that direction of avoiding certain very difficult subjects, but we don't dismiss it, that's for sure. And when we do whisper, people are told in tradition, listen a little harder. So it's not that we don't want to hear it. It's that the tradition says, you need to discuss this. You need to hear this. You need to read this. You need this as part of your narrative. And this year, I want to suggest that we have to have as part of our narrative the idea that we are one family. Am Yisrael cannot be one family until one family is back together, and we are, in essence, hoping for that and praying for that at our Seder experiences. Because our captives are yet redeemed, because people are held captive, even on a larger philosophical level, to the very battles and wars we are fighting in. And so I want to take this at two levels. The actual hostages themselves, and I want to talk a little bit about how to think through philosophically what this time kind of feels like as hostages to yet another episode of Amar Aleinu, those enemies who rose against us in every generation. That there's a certain way that we have to bring this sense of being hostages, you know, in a larger kind of way. I'm going to start with that second one. When I was speaking with a group of colleagues before we really got into the issue of redeeming captives that Barry drove me down into sources for tonight, I was thinking through both levels with colleagues, and particularly more focused on Amar Aleinu lechalotenu ela shebechol dor vador. Every generation, another enemy came and tries to overcome us, and we ourselves must trust in the Lord to redeem us from Israel, from those kinds of enemies that come generation after generation. This is a part of the Haggadah that we're going to say on Pesach. So when we think about this, and we think about the upcoming holiday, there is a certain sense of thinking and feeling that we again are faced with an enemy who would overcome us, who would not only enslave some of us, but would literally murder us. And that we saw very explicitly within the video footage that was really presented, and that was just displayed for the world in a way that makes the Haggadah come to life in a unprecedented manner within this generation, and perhaps for some, you'll find yourself thinking, oh, well, maybe it's not as cruel or evil or this or that as other pictures of the Holocaust in the 20th century or the War of Independence and the experiences we have there. Well, for the Jewish people, I would say that we're defining this generation as kind of post the Holocaust and Hakamat Medina. We're saying that this generation in the Haggadah, what's brought to life is this current generation, us now, and what we truly experience. We bring ourselves to think about being held hostage to cycles of history in this regard. And I just want to put that out there in this philosophical sense that one could hope for some amount of redemption to being caught in the great cycles of history. And this is where Purim and Pesach can come together, because we're supposed to bring a little Purim into our Pesach, because that's the beginning of redemption. Purim's message is, it's sometimes in your hands. Though we have this kind of tradition that God is really there in the Megillah, despite God's name not being mentioned in the Megillah, we really do have a tradition that God woke us up and encouraged Esther and encouraged the governmental leaders and encouraged the everyday people, the Jews who lived in the kingdom, to take up arms and defend themselves. And the idea of not knowing the difference between a Mordechai and a Haman, that gets down to, as we mentioned this year several times, really finally recognizing we had better figure out how to just stop this crazy cycle of people who would want destruction and then respond to their willingness to kill us, and then after our response, feeling strong and secure as Jews, another one marches up right up there and wants to kill us again. And then what's not knowing the difference, in other words, was part of this cycle that we're not going to know the difference of the great cycles of hate and rising up to defend ourselves and needing God's help to do that and needing to find our own strength until we actually figure out a way forward to use the lessons of Purim and to use the lessons of the Seder to fully realize this possibility. So that I hope is a little bit of philosophy. If that sparks anyone's questions at the Seder table, to say, how does the story of going out of Egypt and the Passover traditions that are at our Seder remind us to be instruments of salvation, of the salvation that God actually helped the Jewish people realize during that time in Egypt, then we're getting to a good question for ourselves and a good discussion just on that level alone. Now to the Seder itself with the hostages. If we want to have redemption of captives as an elemental part of our consciousness, we should know the sources behind the redemption of captives. And I have a source sheet prepared in the classic Sefaria way now. And I said right from the start, I just want to put this out there. There were people bringing forward an argument that said it should have been that it was more like from the beginning, instead of bring them home now, not to dismiss any of the good work that the Families Forum has done with the hostages, because when we say bring them home now, we're reminded of the Israeli hostages family forum who have done incredible work, and we're with them heart and soul. But some people have asked, why couldn't we start right from the beginning and say, let my people go? Shlach et ami, shlach et hachatufim. Send out the hostages from your clutches and release them. We have been saying that in our tefillot. When we pray upstairs for the hostages, we say, release the hostages to their family homes. We remember that we're not only praying for the Israeli Jewish hostages, we remember African Muslim hostages and Thai hostages among them. So we are saying, let my people go, meaning Israelis who are held captive, those who were in Israel who are held captive, let them go. We're saying, bring them home. The bring them home piece is because we do have an obligation to bring them home. And the Families Forum really is basing themselves on a very deep biblical idea. Vayishma Avram ki nishba achiv. When Avram heard that his brother was taken captive, what did he do? Vayarek et chanichav yelidei veto shmona saru shlosh meot vayirdof ad Dan. So Avram was in the center of Israel, if you will, and he goes all the way up north to Dan to find Lot. And he divides himself against them by night, he and his servants, and smote them. So he uses nighttime tactics to actually get to free those who are taken captive. And he brought back all the goods. Vayashev et kol harachush, v'gam et Lot achiv urechusho heshiv, v'gam et hanashim ve'et ha'am. Now look at this. This is an interesting verse, because if I bring you into this verse, why does it say, and he brought back all the goods first? Why wouldn't it say, and he brought back Lot, his brother, and by the way, here, and his goods, and the women and the people? Why wouldn't it say Abraham got to them, he brought back Lot, the women and the people, and all their goods? The point is that somewhere in here, the amount of goods and the wealth that was stolen is also important in this whole matter and enterprise of the hostage situation. How much will we spend? What is the price we're willing to pay? And are there any limits, halachically, when it comes to what we will spend on redeeming captives? And so these are questions that already are in the Torah's language in Genesis. And if one wanted to, during Pesach, this is a very big heter, and don't think I'm an apikoros, please. You cannot think I'm, upending all of tradition for the entire life of the Jewish people. I'm going to go off and the screen share to look at all your faces, whoever I can see. And I'm going to say, don't think this is heresy. If you would just study that biblical source from Genesis that I just threw on the screen as your discussion, as your launch pad for a discussion during the Magid section, if you didn't do all the midrashim about Deuteronomy, but you read through the verses, you did one line of what's there for Deuteronomy, if you're a Haggadah family and you're really doing the whole Haggadah, and then you took the Bereshit text and you used it instead, you'd be living Talmudically. You'd be making a Seder that was more like the original Seders of the rabbis, where they actually made it a night of putting something new on the table and learning something out with the people around and really discussing an issue and really talking about something very, very prevalent, very real, very political, very spiritual, very lawful, very much related to their lives at that time, and using the Seder night to get ready to really act on what they needed to in life, to sustain the Jewish people, to feel measures of redemption, and to move us into a future. So, little bit of suggestion. This source sheet is going to be public. Anybody who wants to use any part of it can use any part of it. It's going to be on sefaria.org, and you can use any part of the the source sheet. Now, the Mishnah that Barry mentioned to me is this one. And a little give and take before Barry later tells you how he's going to, incorporate all of this or some of it into his Seder, because I don't even know. I haven't heard that. I'm looking forward, Barry, to hearing your reflections on that. But this is the Mishnah that you mentioned to me that you had been reflecting on and that you looked at. And it says, we do not ransom captives for more than they are worth, due to tikkun olam. Yes, the phrase tikkun olam is in the Mishnah. No, it doesn't mean every social justice movement in the world. It actually means for social order. For social order, we don't ransom captives for more than they're worth. Because if I pay an exorbitant amount, what's that going to mean for those who are thinking of taking more captives tomorrow? If I'm willing to pay a mega price every time you take a captive, so I pay you the price, what are you going to do tomorrow? Going to take another captive. I got to pay you a mega price. It's going to go up. The Jewish people do this not only for themselves. The Jewish people want this for the world. We can't encourage terrorists by paying such a high price. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says it's due to the enactment of the captives. Well, what's the second reason? Just take a look. I gave you the quick explanation of the Mishnah from Rabbi Aviad Tabori from Yeshivat Har Etzion. That is a yeshiva that has an online set of lessons based on all kinds of Jewish topics. Wonderful yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim. The Mishnah explains that this halacha is because of tikkun olam, changing the world for the better. He even uses a more open translation for tikkun olam than keeping the social order or making good policies for the world that keep morality in focus. In other words, we must act responsibly for the entire nation of Israel and not necessarily think only about the individual. So here he brings it to the national level of Israel. I would say, since it said olam, he brings it responsibly for the entire world and not just about individuals who are held captive. We have to act responsibly for the whole world. We must consider the welfare of the community against the welfare of the captive. The Gemara gives two reasons for the ruling: preventing a burden on the community, since collecting large sums of money to free a captive causes great strain on the community, and discouraging extortion, since paying exorbitant sums of money in exchange for captives inevitably leads to more kidnapping. So A, there's an exorbitant price for the community itself, and B, there's that extortion and exorbitant sums will be asked the next time and the next time. So there's that two-sided dimension here, according to Rabbi Tabori. I just want to show you in one other place in Gittin that there's a Braita that comes where they do pay a seriously elevated amount for a hostage. Because it's our inclination to want to free them at all costs, right? Here's the incident involving Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania. Once went to the great city of Rome, and they said to him, there's a child in prison. In other words, he's held captive with beautiful eyes and an attractive appearance, and his curly hair is arranged in locks. And Rabbi Yoshua went and stood by the entrance of the prison, and he said, as if speaking to himself, who gave Jacob for a spoil and Israel to the robbers? In other words, who gave Jewish people to these rulers who are going to demand a high price? Who gave Israel to the robbers, people who are going to rob us of our wealth? Who would do such a thing? How could God let them take children captive? Right? Are we not living that today? And here we are. That child answered by reciting the continuation of the verse in Isaiah. Did not the Lord, he against whom we have sinned and in whose ways they would not walk, neither were they obedient to his law? Oh, here we have like a gut punch to some of the old theology that was around. The child says, is it not our fault we're sinning? Have we not missed the mark? The only way I can live with this kind of Talmudic passage and these kind of theological claims in my life is to say that it's just a little bit of a zetz to say, human beings, you know what? You could do better. The whole thing is just crazy. That there would be enemies of Israel, that there would be hostage takers, that there would be people who demand ransom, that there would be murderers, that there would be people who thought that this, with all the gifts we had, is a way to live life. And so this child who's quoting the great prophet Isaiah, who says, yeah, we're all suffering this for the sins. When I think of sin, and they may not have in the ancient world thought this, so this is a totally different way of reading. I think are you okay? Can everybody still hear me? Yeah? Oh, I just had like a blackout of the electronics here for a second. Okay. So I think though in the past, sin and punishment theology might have led some to think we were being punished in all kinds of crazy ways, including having hostages taken because of our sins. Push that aside. I think philosophically, though, there's a deeper read, even from the ancients, that says we're just missing out how to figure out how to live together in this world with all these crazy hegemonic powers, with all these crazy empires, with all these crazy uh, armies swirling around us, with all these peoples who we're going to have to figure out how to live in this world with. But that's my larger and more kind of philosophical read on pet, that is to miss the mark. And we're still missing the mark, right? And anybody who wants to say it's because we haven't figured out the way forward and lodge any kind of criticism about us finding a way forward with our neighbors and with other peoples and this and that, I suppose I'm giving some openness to that. That is philosophically. Emotionally, I'm not there. And I'm not ready to really be in that discussion. And I have to admit that, where you can live in different kind of lines of reality, but here we have to take into consideration too that you could go yet a different direction and say that the kid innocently quotes the rest of the verse. The rabbi didn't. And so let's pull back everything I said and say the Rav said, how could the Lord have done this? And the kid who innocently knows the full verse because he's such a nice and great student, he quotes the fact that it was because of our sins. But the rabbi didn't say that. The rabbi's absolutely blaming those evildoers who took this kid hostage. And that's all he's doing. And we have to call the kidnappers, we have to call the murderers, we have to call the terrorists what they are. And there's moral clarity to the rabbis quoting only half of the verse at that point, because it's not time to talk about refining our ways when we've got someone kidnapped and being held as a prisoner. And that is, of course, in our moment, to me, much more pertinent to the situation of these butchers and these kidnappers and these evildoers who are holding so many hostage, whether they are holding bodies or they are holding those of our loved ones who could be returned to their families' homes. And so that's a powerful story. And it says, what does the rabbi do? He took an oath by the temple service that I will not move from here until I ransom him for whatever sum of money they set for him. And so you tell me what price and I am paying. And I'm not going to move from that spot. Amrulo lo zaz misham ad shepidao b'mamon harbe. He didn't move from there until they ransomed him for a great sum. V'lo hayu yamim muatim ad shehora hora Yisrael. And then it was not but a few days when that very child issued rulings in Israel as a great sage. And who was that child? It was Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. And for the rabbis to say that that child needed to be redeemed because he would be a Talmid Chacham, he would be a sage, there are two ways to go here too. One, if I know he's a sage, I have to pay a higher price because Jewish law says I pay a higher price for a sage. It's in their own self-interest. Two is they could be very generous and say, at that point, that child was simply a Jew. He was referred to as Jacob. He was referred to as Israel with the verse. And look what he became. And if we hadn't saved him, we would not have Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha this day. Not that they knew right from the start and they only paid more money because of exactly he was a child virtuoso. The person we saved could become a great one in Israel, a great light, as everyone is a great light. And we ought to pay. The historical test case goes to Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. So now fast forward from Abraham to 13th century. And at the age of 70, he's taken captive by King Rudolf I of Germany and held ransom for 20,000 marks, which is an astronomical sum in those days. Almost all the rabbis and leaders of the European Jewish communities in that generation were students of Rabbi Meir, known as the Maharam. He authored thousands of halachic responsa. The point is, Maharam's students and admirers were prepared to raise the sum necessary to free their master. And they based their willingness on Rabbi Joshua's rescue of the young child, who became Rabbi Ishmael. So they just used that story that we heard in Gitin. A second justification provided by Tosafot is that due to the unparalleled scholarship of the child, which Rabbi Yeshua obviously sensed, he was permitted to pay the inflated ransom. So the students of Maharam felt similarly, but Maharam himself, and here's the chap, Maharam himself rejected this rationale as he felt that this would lead to the capture of other Torah leaders. As explained by the 16th century halachist Rabbi Shlomo Luria, Maharam feared that his ransom would lead to a much greater threat to the continuity of Judaism should all the Jewish scholars be made easy bait for ransom to a point where the community would not have the money to ransom them, ultimately leaving them without any leadership at all. He died in captivity 7 years later in the fortress that he was kept in. Now, fast forward again in history. You remember Gilad Shalit, and you remember that the terrorists who are out on the street today are part of the deal that we made when Gilad Shalit was free. This is a letter from Noam and Aviva Shalit to Gilad on June 27th, 2006. Our dear sweet Gilad, Mom and Dad Yoel and Hadass are very concerned for you, want to hear from you, and are hoping you're well and feeling all right, as good as possible in your condition. We're hoping you can read this, and we want you to know that everything possible is being done to bring you home to Mitzpeh Hilah and the Galilee as quickly as possible, to your family, your room that's waiting for you, and to help us with the B&B rooms. Know that we're thinking of you all the time and hoping you're managing somehow and surviving these difficult moments. We know and believe that whoever's holding you also has a family and knows what we're going through and will know to watch over you and your health, loving you and encouraging you, Mom and Dad. I mean, how heartbreaking. Thank God we know he's back home. But we know and we feel and we sense that other families are going through this right now. And they are both broken and full of hope. They're angry and they're full of conviction. And they're out there sending the best to their families and wanting them to know that they're not alone. That's the most important thing. And since that's the case, the thing that I'll say is that we'll say at this level of including people like he was held hostage at our Seders, for me, the suggestion I'm going to make is that there needs to be a place for a hostage at the Seder table. There needs to be an empty chair. There needs to be a place setting. There needs to be an Israeli flag on that chair, or some kind of bring them home now, or some kind of let my people go flag that we put so that we are really saying, you're never alone, any of you, we have you in our hearts. There's a general way of continuing that would go towards the halachic pieces here. And I wanted to bring you tonight this sense of there is a halachic history here, and that we have had debates within our time about just how big a price we were willing to pay. In 1970, Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who was a very famous rabbi, boarded a plane which was hijacked and forced to land in Jordan. And so it's the first time since the kidnapping of the Maharam, who we read about earlier, that the Jewish community debated the application of the rule that was referenced in the Talmud. And that for a Talmid Chacham, there's no limit to what ransom may be paid. But what are we to do about the limits that were discussed? And the notion that there could be limits. And the notion today that there's a desire to really pay a big price, maybe release thousands of prisoners, put big money on the table, make big deals for the release of the hostages. Since, let me read this section. Since, where is this? Listen to this. Why isn't this going up? Hold on, I'm just having a little technical difficulty here. I need this to come down. Why isn't this coming down? Here we go. Although generally in a case of the rescue of captives, the Jewish community is forbidden to ransom a captive for an exorbitant sum. The ruling in the case of a great scholar is that he should be ransomed even for a sum that exceeds his worth. Many rabbis were of the opinion that every effort should be made to secure Rabbi Hutner's release. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, very famous, dissented, arguing that the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim only applies in peacetime, but surely not during hostilities and wars, when the delivery of ransom money to the enemy would strengthen their position. He continued to explain that although a ceasefire existed at the time, and this is an interesting kind of question, the 1948 War of Independence had never really ended. What a position. That 1948 war never really ended. And for the Arabs' avowed goal to destroy the state of Israel and drive the Jews into the sea had never been renounced. And if you want to go so far as to say that we're in this time of hostility and war because we've heard that again, or at least realized that they wanted to make good on the word in the Hamas charter, that Israel should be destroyed. They wanted to make good on their word in Iran, and through their proxies really tried to be in this staged now war of independence posture instead of all coming at us at once to stage the various attacks. We just lived through 300 drones and ballistic missiles. That we're really engaged there. And so to Rav Kamenetsky, vis-a-vis Pidyon Shvuyim, the redemption of captives, it meant we were not allowed to deliver ransom money because it would strengthen the enemy position. Similarly, Rav Yisrael Rosen, editor of the proclaimed series Techumim, wrote an article questioning the heavy price which Israel paid for the release of Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier taken captive, in 2006. After quoting the many articles throughout Israel's history of kidnappings, he concluded that one cannot use the Gemara and Gittin as a reference in cases where the ransom is not money, but rather freeing live terrorists. In these cases, he argues that halakha remains neutral and leaves room for tactical decisions to be made by the government. And isn't that what we're going through now? Tactical decisions. Galat urges hostage deal as government stalls over sending delegation to talks. That's March 17th, 2024. And then, of course, we have Hamas spurns latest hostage deal proposal, demands permanent ceasefire. The idea that we have Jewish law to really focus on in the modern state of Israel regarding the trade of prisoners and hostages might be centered, though, and located in Rav Ovadia Yosef's halachic teachings. And what I shared with Barry was a series of articles, part 1, part 2, and part 3, by Eli Fisher, who lives in Modi'in, where Bob and Judy Golub live. And he has translated parts of Rav Ovadia Yosef's tshuva, his halachic responsum, regarding the trading of hostages for the Entebbe hostages, or the trading of prisoners, terrorist prisoners, for those hostages at the time. And I just, to give you the brief facts and not spend all the time within these 3 translations or these articles that talk about the different sections of Rabbi Yosef's work, you know that an Air France airplane was on its way from Paris to Israel, hijacked by terrorists. The plane landed in Uganda. And according to the halacha, the question arose, should the terrorists imprisoned in Israel be released as the hijackers demand to save the lives of the abducted Jews? Rabbi Yosef writes long tshuvot. You think he's at one place by bringing a certain source, because you could rely on that source to go a direction that you might want to go. But I remind everyone that he's encyclopedic and he likes to summarize things. And so at certain times within his halachic thinking, he has to bring you a source that may disagree entirely with either the very right or left approach he takes, clear black or white approach he takes, or he may use them all at the end sometimes to be very nuanced. And again, leave open spaces for people to make very, very open discussions and kind of pertinent decisions regarding the situations in which we find ourselves. The context matters in Jewish law. And he was someone to bring you a way of going forward within Jewish law and sometimes provide the exact answer. But he also wanted you to have the encyclopedic knowledge of all the sources that might be brought to bear on a given subject, so that when you ask the question and consider your current context, you would have all the sources that you wanted to have. And that's kind of thinking about Rav Yosef as a teacher of halacha within modern Israel, and to Israeli authorities who might be those in power at the time, or engaged or asked when people wanted to get some clarifications about Jewish law. And so what he did bring up is that there's this Tosefta. We have a text that says, a group to whom Gentiles said, give us one of you and we will kill you. And if you do not, we will kill you all. They should all be killed and not hand over a single Jewish life. But if they specify in a certain case, Shiva ben Bichri, a certain individual, they should hand him over and not be killed. One, for the sake of the group. Now, there's lots of sources that come to limit when that one individual can be handed over. But the fundamental question that is brought up in one of the oldest documents we have, the Tosefta, is one of the oldest we have. That is right here, Tosefta. That is parallel to the Mishnah and at the earliest layer of rabbinic text. And what that means is that the rabbis are kind of putting a baseline thought out there, a philosophical or a halachic concept that says, send one for the benefit of others, but then rabbinic literature will come and say, but here are the times that that's really limited. If there's any power of negotiation, negotiate. If it's a decent price, pay it. If it seems exorbitant, you might even consider it. And if they want something in exchange for that, you might even give up X, Y, or Z. So we have lots of times that there's a serious limitation. The earliest rabbinic sources severely limit the circumstances under which a group of Jews may hand over one of their own, so that the collective is spared. As he often does, Rabbi Yosef concludes his exhaustive discourse on the various aspects of the dilemma by introducing a distinction that allows him to circumvent any textual precedents. Handing someone over is a form of collaboration with the killers. And one may not collaborate, even on the pain of death. An exchange of prisoners, however, fundamentally, as he looks at all the limitations that they put on this, and he sees possibilities that they've defined in rabbinic literature, he says an act of handing over prisoners, an exchange of prisoners, that's an act of rescue, not of collaboration, and therefore might be permitted. And he says might be permitted because he's going to go through and he's going to say, how much are we really willing to exchange? And what about the danger that it really imposes? Now, I'm going to come back to this source that the Rambam wrote, that we mentioned. But Chief Ovadia Yosef was asked whether we could exchange the hostages, which would be the exchange of hostages for prisoners. And he's then going to bring you two different opinions to say, there's one sage that says you have to endanger yourself and do the trade, and another sage that says, I don't want you to put yourself in any danger. And you're forbidden from putting yourself in danger. And that's the major question. Rabbi Yosef concludes in the penultimate paragraph of this next section that the question of exchanging dangerous terrorists for the Entebbe hostages would still be a matter of dispute between the opinions of these two sages, the Radbaz and Hagahot Maimoniot, who are commenting on Rambam's text that redemption of captives is the greatest mitzvah, and you have to put it over and above providing for the poor, and lots of different mitzvahs to accomplish by redeeming them, and lots of different violations you've done if you don't redeem them. But it seems that in the present case, we would have to release the 40 terrorists imprisoned here, since even though it might result in their posing renewed danger, it remains uncertain. He puts a separate little thing there to say, I'm not certain of the danger that these terrorists might inflict upon our society, and I have the urgent need of releasing hostages versus the possibility in the future that these people will be threats to my society. That notion of thinking about potential threats in the future versus impending danger becomes very important in the thinking. And Rav Yosef bolsters the argument for the distinction between immediate danger and future danger by citing a rather surprising precedent. And Barry, here's where I really thought you'd get a kick out of reading that part 3, which I hope added an interesting twist. Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, who was the chief rabbi of Prague and one of the towering figures of the late 18th century, was once posed a question from London. Could surgeons be trained by performing autopsies, which are generally forbidden, on corpses? Rabbi Landau ruled that if a patient was present, and if conducting the autopsy would directly help the performance of the surgery here and now, it was permitted. Under normal circumstances, however, autopsies were forbidden, even though they advanced the medical profession and contributed to the saving of lives in the future. So someone's there now and you can really rescue, you do it. Someone's going to gain in the future, we're hesitant. Now, we've changed the law even on that with autopsies. We say in a family, if we really can discover something, that an autopsy could be warranted. It's a little bit of a discussion. It's a little bit of a debate. It all depends on the circumstances. It all depends on the framework and situation of the family's willingness to engage Jewish law at a time that's very fraught and very emotional and what have you. But these are questions that come up with families who want to really abide by Jewish tradition. And it's like that with this issue of captives. The idea is that at the heart of Pidyon Shivuyim, the redemption of captives, is the difficult, perhaps impossible dilemma which faces Israel now. How do we balance the immediate needs of the captives with Tikkun Olam, the world order, the notion of paying during hostilities time, the way that it will impact other terrorist organizations and their acting in the world. How do we really help fix this whole situation in the world and get rid of this time of war and move towards the time of at least neighborly relations, if not peace? The Talmud offers two views on how refusing to overpay benefits the world. First, if Jews were to overpay to ransom their captives, it would place communities under a great financial burden. And second, it would incentivize potential captors. Let's even talk about the financial burden that is really the result of needing to increase the security on all fronts, technologically and manpower, or as they say, human resources. Not just the cost of how much money we're going to raise now and put in their hands with cash. Though greasing the peace with a few dollars is something that we're very aware of that goes on in the world, folks. You know, whether it's greasing the peace of Hamas in their bank accounts or greasing the peace of, well, while we have sanctions in Iran, still paying them a little bit, right? Still allowing some billions to go through. We know this all happens all the time within the world structure, within the structure of peoples and state actors now in our time. But we have this notion, like, will it incentivize potential captors to target Jews particularly? And will it really add further corruption and terror into the whole world theater? Rav Yosef applies the rationale to the case of the Entebbe hostages. He was back then, and he shows that even if you want to go towards a no negotiation mantra, that there were exceptions to the rule, and we have to do the tactical kind of decisions that we read about in the modern journal in Israel. Before I ask Barry to really reflect, I'll just bring us into the source that Barry reminded me about. And that's back up here, because this Maimonidean source is the famous one with this whole situation, and that is Pidyon Shvuyim Kodem Leparnasat Oniyim Ulichsutan. The redemption of captives receives priority over sustaining the poor and providing them with clothing. So that's a big statement in Mishnah Torah, gifts to the poor, because there's a requirement once you move into a neighborhood, once you move into a community, to really make sure that you are involved in sustaining the poor. It's the soup kitchen you have to contribute to, and it's to provide clothing, and it's to provide housing. But what he's saying is that this is the mitzvah that's bigger than that. It's greater than that. Hashvui harehu b'chlal harevim v'atzmeim v'harumim. The captive is among those who are hungry, thirsty, and unclothed, and he's in mortal peril. V'omed b'sakanat nefashot. He really stands at mortal danger, with mortal danger, peril. V'amalim enav mipidyono. And if you do not really seek his redemption, hareze over, you are transgressing certain mitzvahs. We say you are hardening your heart. In other words, do not harden your heart or close your hand. You're transgressing another mitzvah. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. Don't stand idly by the blood of your brother. You're transgressing. Don't harden your heart or close your hand. You're transgressing. Do not stand by when the blood of your neighbor is in danger. And you're transgressing. He shall not oppress him with exhausting work. And he's negated the observance of the positive commandments. And one of the things that I was reminded of when Barry mentioned to me this source and how surprising it is sometimes that we see this priority level given to the redemption of captives, is that it had, you're transgressing lo ta'aseh mitzvahs. Here's a whole list of thou shalt nots, thou shalt nots, thou shalt nots that he brings up and lines, and he lines up. And the positive mitzvah, if you ever thought, like, what does it mean to really love my neighbor? Here's what it means in a positive way, that I have to redeem the captives whenever there are captives. And so he says, you are missing, and you shall love thy neighbor. Vatsel uchim lamavet, and you shall save those who are taken from death. And there's a lot more in terms of mitzvahs that you are transgressing and not fulfilling. And there is no mitzvah as great as the redemption of captives. He brings right after that this notion that comes from the Gemara, Ein podin et hashvuyim bieter al dmehen. We don't redeem captives for more than they're worth. So right after he tells you it's so important, he really says, but I agree with the Mishnah that says, don't go so far that our enemies will pursue and kidnap more people. And we don't want to really endanger the lives of others. We don't want to have people so burdened with that kind of stress on their resources, but keep them in mind, in heart, in prayer. And there's lots of exceptions to this rule in number 12. And he'll bring exceptions upon exceptions, just like the other rabbinic literature that we referenced in those modern tshuvot, to say, but at a certain point in time, if you want to take the approach that now is the time for rescue, it's urgent. And you can put off worried about danger that is not so immediate, but you can respond to that with enough ingenuity and resources that you can make for a safer society based on a threat that you perceive. You could really tease that out of the Maimonidean sources as well. If we were going to have, nights and nights of learning within, we would have to look where he hints at that. But that is kind of where I wanted to leave it off and say to Barry, what did you understand from reading, this source and considering this source? Where are you after looking at Rav Ovadia Yosef's material, if you did look at those, or any of the other kind of thinking you're really approaching with the hostage situation, and how you're going to incorporate it in your Pesach experience and Seder?
First, let me thank you, Rabbi, for letting me share part of this. Also, let me apologize for my laryngitis. And just say that because we did share texts, I will be going through some of the same material, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective. And now let me see if I can share my screen. All right, can you see that? Rabbi?
Yes, we can see it.
I can see it. Can everybody see it?
Okay, so let me just put this in presentation mode. So I think starting with the Torah is definitely the right thing to do. And as with Rabbi Bolton, I focused on Abraham. You've heard Rabbi Bolton go through this in detail. But there's one thing that did jump out at me in one of the texts that I read, and that is that when Abram heard of his, and here they use the word kinsman, but I know, and in Rabbi Bolton's translation, it's brother. And every time I would read this, I would be puzzled by it, because we know that Lot isn't his brother. But one interpretation of this is that they change from what they know is his actual blood relationship to the word brother because of what he's about to do in redeeming him. And that the relationship among all Jews with regard to redemption is really the equivalent of being a brother. And I think that's actually a very nice addition to this very, very, very well-known story. I have another, I came across another, to be honest with you, I forgot about this. I had once heard it, but I forgot it. But I heard of another Torah connection, and that is in the Ten Commandments, the command not to steal. And that, because the Ten Commandments, as you know, comes up twice, and because you can only learn one thing from a given text, of course, we have a common sense of notion of what it means not to steal. But the other interpretation is you're not allowed to steal people. You're not allowed to kidnap. And so I think that these are two really powerful Torah sources that people can think about. And I think especially putting it right into the Ten Commandments, I think is a very, very powerful way of thinking about it. Uh, every morning we come to Minyan. This is where we start. We start on page 10. And you can see that praised are you, Adonai, our God, who rules the universe, releasing the bound. So this is not casual. This is the real deal. This is among the things that are so important that I'm pointing out where we place them. This is between giving sight to the blind and clothing the naked. That's the two above it. And then raising the downtrodden, providing for all of my needs. And I've seen other translations. Rabbi, maybe you can do better than I on what the actual best English translation is, but I have seen this translation of who releases the imprisoned. And I've organized my thinking about this in a slightly different way that helps me to sort of frame this in terms of maybe some sort of taxonomy. So number one is redemption of captives takes precedence over all other charitable acts. And then this is actually connected in some of the sources to this follow-on, which I don't think Rabbi Bolton emphasized. So let me share this aspect of it. And it says, every minute of delay is considered the equivalent of shedding of blood. I mean, if you really want to make clear the obligation of speed, I think this verse is actually incredibly powerful to frame this in that way. And I think that it just shows how, as Rabbi Bolton said, how crucial this is. I don't know if anybody else has gotten to the Maimonides show at the Center for Jewish History, but long before all of this, when Bobby and I went there, this really fascinated me. Pardon my not so great photography. This, in fact, is a receipt for redemption of captives. In the Mishneh Torah, amid laws devoted to charity, Maimonides ruled that there is no greater mitzvah than the redemption of captives. This Geniza fragment, along with others like it, is evidence of Maimonides' active involvement in this mitzvah, written soon after his arrival in Fustat, is receipt for funds raised for the return of Jewish captives taken following the Crusader assault on the Bilbets in northeast Egypt. And I didn't appreciate it, but much of Maimonides' fame at the time he was active actually came from his organization of missions for redemption. And I think that again reinforces the centrality of this. So you've already heard Rabbi go through this one, and these are the two reasons that are of concern. And I think that it's very clear that from the very beginning, the thinking about all of this is about the impact on the total community, meaning that, yes, the hostage is of inestimable value, but the community is actually of greater value. And the reason for that, I take it, is the community is all about the future. And if you do something that so compromises the community, if you bankrupt the community, you really have not done your appropriate weighing of what are the pros and cons. And that theme constantly emerges from all of the writings. Rabbi didn't put too much emphasis on this, but if you saw on the last slide or the last source he showed you, essentially the second one says you shouldn't assist them in escaping. And so this is my language, so don't take this as authoritative. But essentially, if you use force to redeem the hostages, meaning you assist them by by going in. If it fails, there are statements by learned people about this. It's likely to make life worse for the hostages. So understanding the risks of this, and what this leaves you with is exactly what Rabbi Bolton emphasized, that negotiations and diplomacy are the preferred paths. One thing that Rabbi Bolton didn't emphasize is there's another example where someone goes and wants to ransom someone, and they say, no, the price is too high. And then he says, well, I've got enough money to do it. I'm not going to bankrupt the community. And they say, okay, you can do that. And the reason is, again, keeping with the theme, is that it's not going to have a profoundly negative impact on the community, although obviously you could make the argument that this will encourage more kidnapping anyway, and hostage taking anyway. They don't condone it, but they don't disallow it. So it exists in this sort of moral limbo. But again, because of, at least my interpretation, because this is less of a threat to the community, it actually is something they didn't want to completely, refuse to accept. Okay, so let me just see here. And it's, I don't know why it's doing this, but okay. Yeah, so now I can't even read mine here. So, because I've got my thing up there. So let's see if I can get it to move. No, I can't get it to move. Okay, so let's see if I. So
You need me to read it out loud?
No, yeah, read the top part.
If there is fear for the life of the hostage in captivity versus just for money.
Okay, so we all know Pekuah Nefesh, Nefesh, and so now the question is, are they really just being stolen for ransom money, or are they being stolen in a context in which their life is at risk? Because now we're changing the rules of the game, because now we have a life at stake, and all of a sudden, things that might not be appropriate for a hostage is appropriate to save a life. And it's interesting that there's so much back and forth about this. Rambam rejects this because every hostage's life is in danger. I would say, this is my next sentence, I'd say that that's perhaps not quite so true if the hostage is still worth more to the hostage takers alive than dead. And that's a real issue. And the whole people have really talked a lot about whether modern terrorism motives for prisoner release is different from economic gain motive of past abductors. And I think that this is really complicated. And as you know, Israel has redeemed the remains of people. So that really raises an issue about the whole question of the importance of the perception of the hostage holder, and sort of doing theory of mind to understand what they're thinking, which, needless to say, is not so easy. You can read the top line again for me, sorry.
If hostage made views known before being taken, like Israeli soldiers who wrote letters describing the hostage's feelings about being redeemed, or if the hostage refuses to be redeemed at the stated price, the hostages themselves.
Right. So I read about examples of Israeli soldiers who, when going into the military, and based on knowing the history, have indicated in writing, so that it's definable, that they don't want to be redeemed for prisoners under no circumstances. And so I think that needless to say, that wouldn't mean that you wouldn't try to redeem them. But I think that it's I think it's something that's very important to consider. And again, as you've already heard, I'm not going to repeat, and I looks like I misspelled Rabbi Meir's story of refusing to be redeemed. And he was the Chacham, you know. I mean, there was no greater Torah scholar at that time than him. So, but he was obsessed with the idea that other rabbis would then become targets. And he felt that he really had an obligation to protect the rabbis rather than just a general notion that if you if you say he's worth more and hostage takers know that, that's a really very difficult and a situation he really didn't want to be contributing to. Rabbi Bolton didn't talk about this, but I did find that, in fact, there was a premium on bringing out women hostages. And I found this one quote. I'm not sure exactly, I don't remember exactly which source it came from, but there was real concern then, and painfully even more concern now, over sexual abuse and sexual assault of women hostages. And so women hostages were clearly made a priority. And now we're back to this question of what makes a person of great value to the community. And so we're back to this issue of this tension between the individual and the community. If I say, you know, we have somebody here and we have the whole community, and what they're demanding is going to wind up destroying the community, if we say destroying this one person will have relatively little impact on the future of the community, well, that's one thing. On the other hand, if that one person they have is your chief Torah scholar, then that's a whole other thing, because Torah scholars really play an absolutely vital role in the continuity of the community. So again, this tension and this theme of how do you make decisions that ensure community continuity, not just an individual life, becomes the kind of thing that the rabbis discussed in enormous detail. Again, Rabbi Bolton didn't cover this, but I also saw discussions about fears, not just fears, but there were, in many situations, there were examples where people were held hostage, were taken hostage, and then if the community didn't ransom them back, they were sold into slavery, because, you know, these are essentially pirates and privateers and guys who really weren't playing by any rules except economic rules. So again, every hostage situation is different, and everyone has this kind of range of context. But this was one of the considerations that I saw being weighed very heavily. I think this is really, for today, though, a crucial thing to understand. Everything that Rabbi Bolton said that comes from Talmudic sources is predicated on having a diaspora Jewish community responsible. And now, the minute you have the state of Israel, you have a very different situation, because states are very, very different from self-identified communities. And this, I think, is one of the most challenging parts of all of this, is how do you take a halakhic tradition that comes out of an experience that is pre-state, and now all of a sudden make that come alive for a state. And I think this is one of the things that, frankly, needs to be thought about more carefully by all of the commentators. I've seen it touched on, but frankly, I don't think that I've seen the kind of penetrating scholarship that I think needs to be brought to it, because what might be a perfectly appropriate consideration for a diaspora Jewish community may need to be really rethought if you're now dealing with a state. The next thing is, it's one thing if you're in a diaspora community and someone comes and steals you. It's a rather different thing if you're now, and that's why I'm doing this after this issue of the state. What if you become a hostage while serving the state? And here's the reality that Rabbi Bolton mentioned. Here are the numbers so that you can actually see. The numbers were in 2011. He was exchanged. Gilad Shalit was exchanged for 1,027 security prisoners, including Sinwar, who had already served 20 years in an Israeli prison, and others involved in the October 7th attack. And I think that what we've heard tonight, this context, I think, is really an important one. And frankly, I think in the United States, I don't think we have the same relationship to what happened around this negotiation and how controversial it was and the decision. And you read that touching letter from Shalit's parents. The emotions around this ran incredibly high, and for appropriate reasons. I do want to point out, though, that almost within days of October 7th, Israel bulked up, shall we say. And I found this on an Al Jazeera. So prior to October 7th, Israel held 5,200 Palestinian captives. Since then, at least, and again, I'm not going to vouch for the PA's statements, but just looking at what I read in Israeli papers about the number of Palestinian Authority people who were arrested, this number actually seems not impossible to me. But you can see that, obviously, I've never seen anybody talk about this out loud, but it's clear that the Israeli government decided that if they're going to wind up needing to exchange, they wanted some of their own opportunity for that exchange. And now, this is perhaps the most painful of all, and I only bring it to you because I think we need to be at a point where we have full discussions of all of these issues. And it's painful for me to even bring this up, but I think that it's one that you may be hearing more about. What if the reason you're a hostage is because you went to the Nova concert and you trusted your Israeli government to protect you? Does that put you in a special category? Does that mean that the state owes you more in terms of your redemption? And some of the things that we saw previously stated may need to be modified. And we have these two fantastic examples of the state of Israel doing just what I said. So I don't think any of us who were alive and sentient in 1976 weren't totally transfixed by what happened in Uganda. I think that it's really interesting to show that this part of it, when they decided who they were going to hold on in the plane, they didn't just take Israelis, they took Jews. And I think anybody who thinks that what they were concerned about is Zionism and not anti-Semitism should go back and take a look at this, because I think this is essentially puts the lie to that. Thank God the commandos rescued 102 of the 106 hostages and killed all of the hijackers. But Israel paid a very, very high price. And Bibi Netanyahu's brother, a person who I think was considered one of the princes of Israel at the time, was killed. Black September in 1972, there was a subpoena flight from Brussels in Israel, and they demanded release of prisoners, and then 16 elite troops. And to be honest with you, I'd forgotten this or never knew it, but those troops included Ehud Barak and Bibi himself, disguised themselves as airline technicians and rescued all but one hostage. So this is what's in the back of the mind of Israelis, Americans, and people all over the world about the magic of Israel and its commitment. The issue of, it's interesting, Rabbi, that totally independently, we came up with the same theme. So I don't know, I don't know exactly what that says about each of us or both of us. But I think this is actually a very important difference, and I'll tell you why. This says we have to go and do something which may be violating that second principle, because this sounds pretty aggressive to me. Bring them home now means go and take an action to bring them home, perhaps even has a militaristic ring to it. This puts the burden on the other side and says, you let my people go. And I don't have to bring them, you have to let them go. And I think this is also the perfect way to frame this for Passover, because essentially what we have to do now is to convince, just one way or another, it may take another 10 plagues, but we need to convince them that they should be letting my people go rather than potentially violating the second principle. I think, let me just see, I had one thing here. Okay, so I'm going to read you this because I think it's absolutely, I think it's really important. But again, I want to apologize because it's also going to sound pretty painful, because I read it and it was very painful for me. It was said by Rabbi Amiel Hirsch, who's the rabbi at Stephen Wise, and actually our daughter and son-in-law and their family are members of Stephen Wise Synagogue, and so we've been to that synagogue a number of times and heard Rabbi Hirsch, who, by the way, previously was a lawyer before entering the rabbinate. So here, the freeing of hostages is an obligation that falls on the community as a whole. This is especially so in Israel for two reasons. One, because unlike the past 2,000 years, Jews have a state whose capacity to redeem the captives is far greater than a weak and vulnerable diaspora Jewish community in, say, the Middle Ages. Two, because the state of Israel, the collective, failed these hostages in stunning and tragic ways on October 7th. This failure goes to the very heart of the Zionist enterprise itself. Israelis sense this most of all. They realize that unless and until the hostages are returned, the collapse of confidence in the state's basic promise to its citizens, by extension to world Jewry, to protect Jews from pogroms, murder, mayhem, and kidnapping, will fester and intensify. It's an existential crisis in the Zionist enterprise itself that we cannot adequately recover from if the hostages are not returned and are left to die or rot in the dungeons of an abandoned jail. So these are really powerful and I think painful things for us to go over, but I think we've all been in pain since October 7th, trying to come to grips with the reality. If I were to end on a Pesach-related positive statement, I would say that Saturday night felt a lot like Pesach. because the angel of death came over the state of Israel, but it passed over the state of Israel. And I think that the pride that we all feel, not only in the military success of that operation, but the diplomatic success. Of course, Israel was joined by a number of allies, including Arab allies, in protecting the Jewish people. And frankly, I don't share Rabbi Hirsch's concern that the Zionist enterprise is at stake here. But I think it's important to see that people are so troubled by this and try to get at the root of why they're troubled so that we can have a dialogue and a discussion, but not to lose hope, not to lose faith. I mean, that's why we sing Hatikva every day, because we're not going to lose hope. And I haven't lost hope, and I haven't lost confidence. That doesn't mean I agree with everything that's done. But I think the image of the sheltering passing over of 300 or however many missiles and drones on Saturday night, to me, is a very, very comforting image, and one that I'm definitely going to share at my Seder.
Awesome, Barry. I think to put that with the Midrash that said that the Kadosh Baruch Hu came to protect the houses, but we had to take some action and create those dinners of communal strength and paint our doors and be strong and proud in the midst of society and the world that was tyrannizing the Jewish people, and stand strong so that the angel knew exactly where we were and exactly when to pass over was very important. And so what an image that conjures up to see that. And I think you're right that it was both military and it was diplomatic success at the same time. I'm going to, given all you just beautifully both summarized and added multidimensionally, verify or kind of really bring you to some texts that state a little bit of what you said before we just open it up to a few last comments or questions, and I'll travel through. The sources in the Rambam do come from the Torah to say we have to start with Torah, not just the Abrahamic story, but that, it was that if there be a needy among you, don't harden your heart, and you shouldn't stand idly by the blood of your brother, and that you shall love your neighbor. So these are don'ts and do's. And this notion that every minute that we don't redeem captives, that was really part of what the Shulchan Aruch comes up with. And it says, Kol rega sheme'acher liftot hashfuyim. Every moment that one delays redeeming captives, where it's possible, the efshar lahakdim have keilu shofech damim. It is as if one is spilling blood. And this is an interesting phrase that was in some cases added and in some manuscripts not there. Where it's possible. Because it realizes that there are possibilities and sometimes we lack the possibilities and resources, either material resources or diplomatic possibilities and channels, and that we have to help create them. When the Shalit deal was happening, 79% of Israelis supported the deal. Palestinian militants vowed to abduct new Galid Shalits over time. And of course, we needed to listen. And where terrorists declare their desire to kidnap and murder Jews, and in fact act upon these declarations without any compassion for the victims, whether men, women, or children, that releasing terrorists is actual danger and is therefore forbidden. Just to think about other voices that have come. He said that in 1983, and it weighs heavy on us now. He says the impact of the morale of the army could be significant. Once a soldier knows that the state will not do everything it can to free him, including a willingness to release murderers in exchange for his freedom, it will diminish motivation. So there are some considerations among what will happen to the state and what will happen to the army among these rabbis. We have been singing this tune, that we are not going to allow these hostages of today's hostages who were celebrating as citizens at the Nova Festival, sat in settled places in Israel since the time of 1948 or 1951, or even a couple of decades ago. Between Shlomit and Pri Gan, you had two communities, one newer, one just a few decades old, and one right there when we decided we had to establish the borders. With the government promised to keep her citizens safe. It's all we can expect from any government in the Western world, in the comity of nations, to ensure the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in our American terms. And that's all we really want to see for every nation. And so we ask that support for the endeavors of the state of Israel are understood among world nations and in our own country. I think Passover is a time to rededicate ourselves to spreading the word, as we had to make public our leaving Egypt. We have to help people leave their narrow places of understanding and to get into more expansive places of unifying with those with moral clarity that governments have rights to ensure that their populations remain within their borders, safe and able to pursue their everyday lives. And that's really what we're fighting for in the end. And that when we talk about what it means to be free this year, and we talk about what it means to be connected to each other as brothers, and Barry mentioned that the Genesis source uses the word brother, and here is Achenu, the first word of this prayer that we've added back every day to the liturgy, and not just Mondays and Thursdays when we say Tachanu. That we hope that all brothers and sisters, our own of Am Yisrael and all humanity, can really get to a place where compassion is among us, the shared value, and that the pursuit of life and happiness really does take precedence. And that's the great Western vision as American Jews we can share. It's the great hope we can share for our brothers and sisters. And so we ring out Achenu Kol Beit Yisrael Anitunim B'Tzara, our brethren, the entire house of Israel who remain in distress. May God have compassion on them and bring them from distress to relief. And we can reread this now. To bring them, and I would say it's bring them home while we proclaim, let my people go. I agree, Barry, and somehow we got here together. It was just meant to be cosmically. I would say that we reread this and say, and bring them from distress to relief is not God's responsibility, it is ours. And that we remain vigilant. And the Midrashic way of reading this famous line, and bring them from distress to relief, from darkness to light, servitude to redemption at this moment. That is in many ways our responsibility, given the tools, power, ingenuity, and commitment we have to be Am Yisrael to this day, this very day, with the miracle of modern Israel and the diaspora community that we are all a part of. So, folks, that's a way to do it. To also sing Achenu Kol Beit Yisrael at your Seder, to set that place for the hostages who should be home, and we should align our hearts with the families who are missing people who can't celebrate this year, and to think about how God passed over and this moment of Saturday night's Iranian attack as just that, as Barry suggested. This source sheet will be public, and the recording will be downloaded and on YouTube if you want to watch through any of this again. And I just want to thank you, Barry. What an amazing chavruta over several days of, life and times among Or Zarua people, that we got to see each other and really share thought and texts. And you brought such a great multi-dimensional approach and sharp insights. And so I thank you
for the
your
invitation,
presentation.
Rabbi.
Folks, comments and questions to wrap up tonight? Ron and then Aaron.
First of all, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Barry, for bringing this up. I want to add two things. First of all, through the history, until Zionist movement came, people who kidnap Jews never paid the price. The Zionist movement was the first one to start to say, hey, guys, you'll pay the price, when the State of Israel was created. Number two, part of the reason of the Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists taking hostages is not prisoner ransom or something like that. They take it to protect themselves. It's part of their policy to negotiate that there will not be targeting killing to protect their own life. So it's a much more complicated issue than just, it's much more ideology and much more complicated than money or prisoner as an exchange. And having them, you know, we have the 133 kidnapper or the hostages, he's protected. He's protected. Nobody will touch him until we will find some way to penetrate this specific situation. And it's not the first time it happened like that. So I just wanted to add this. It's much more complicated than the biblical way or the halacha way or what we knew until 1948.
Very
Yeah,
interesting.
thank you. Thank you. Aaron?
So again, thank you, both of you, for incredibly insightful and meaningful and valuable and important and timely discussion. So I'm not sure if I have a conflict, but I will say that I was not surprised that almost all of those weapons that were flying through the air above Israel were destroyed. I think I expected Israel to be safe. And God looked over Israel and made sure that very few at the most of these destructive weapons fell to the ground. My conflict is that unreasonable to feel, well, I'm not surprised that this happened this way. Israel was kept safe, and it should have been kept safe. That's the only way. Thoughts?
I think this is above my pay grade.
I would say that you're tapping into a deeper emuna, a deeper faith that hu yatzilenu mi adam. There's a piece of this that is godly, and there's a piece that you can't forget to do your part. And we did it with not only the ingenuity we thank God inspired in Israel among those who needed to develop defensive weaponry. It's potentially the first generation that really is involved in using firepower in such a deep defensive way. We can't say enough about that. We should say more at another point about what it means to have developed the defensive weapon industry that has been created in the world by Israeli engineers along with partners around the globe. And look at that diplomatic group, and that is in your pay grade, Barry, to notice, as with all of us, that, wow, there was a family of America and France and UK and Jordan and Saudi Arabia behind them, and people aren't necessarily raising all of that, but it's a very important moment to see that some of these relationships we've created in the Middle East are a matter of the faith that we could get back to one day meeting our brothers or cousins again and potentially making something of it. It's a difficult time to really be in the midst of that conversation for me, at least.
Aaron, I just comment that your very interesting comment reminds me of when the Jews got to the Red Sea, and Moses reassures them that God will take care of everything. And God says, Moses, get moving. Why aren't you doing what you have to do? Why are you reassuring them if you're not actually taking action?
And Nachshon jumped in.
I think that's the, I hope I haven't misinterpreted that, Rabbi, but that's the way I've taken it. And I must
Yep.
say, I think that's the right attitude. Yes, we can have confidence and faith in God, but we certainly have our more than half to do.
By the way,
Mena Mili Mili.
Matitz Akelai, why are you sitting there screaming at me when there's actually what to do? And it's probably a good lesson for how people could wind up figuring out what should we focus on and what kind of work should we do together versus sitting there screaming at each other as well. So that's good inspiration forward.
Well,
Listen-
I just want to add that I think that, as Barry, you've alluded as well, that there's a partnership with God, and all of the forces that had the ability and technology to protect Israel as a human effort was a part of this partnership.
Definitely. We'll take that. We make that partnership an essential part of Gemara learning in general. I want to thank everybody for, allowing me the exit ramp from the Route 66 of Talmud. And we kind of broke off to be in this Inyana Dayoma, this topical discussion and prep for the mitzvah of the Seder and Pesach coming up. It really inspired. Hope to see people on Shabbat and wishing everybody a Chag Sameach. If I don't get to see you personally before Pesach, I want to also remind everyone we don't have class during Pesach. I'll be giving a chabura on the Shabbat of Passover in memory of my father regarding we made packages out of what? And ancient packaging engineering, where we might have learned a little bit of the skill and a little bit about rabbinic texts and the world of packages that we were able to make. And then we have Talmud class May 1st. And the Talmud class will go through the month of May, outside of the very, I think it's right straight through the month of May. The schedule will come out, but the siyum for the class will be at the end of May 29th. So that's the plan for this year. We'll be in touch about further learning opportunities. Mark Ashley's, of course, class starts for Torah Shabbat Pei. Sunday, I call a Moed of Pesach. And this year, of course, put on the calendar the Shabbaton in Mark's honor. At the beginning of May, the 3rd and the 4th, we're hosting Dr. Mark Shapiro at the Scholarly Shabbaton. A full Sabbath we'll be able to celebrate together. So be well, everyone. Chag Sameach. Good
Chag
prepared.
Sameach, Tuda, Laila
Chag
Tov.
Sameach.
Out of the
Thank
house.
you.
everybody.
Weep it all away.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Thank
So-
you.
Mayor.
Thank you very much.